So good morning and welcome to day 2 of Toxic Assets. We're going to keep rearranging the exhibition a little bit just as we're getting started, and thank you to anybody who's tuning in on the live stream for bearing with a slight delay this morning as we've gotten ourselves rearranged for a different setup for what is going to be a very dense but I think rewarding day of theoretical pairings of research and work, all on the topic of toxic properties. So today we're really looking very closely at the construction of property, the governance of property, and languages, including contract languages and poetics by which property is inscribed, as well as a number of artistic practices. So each of the pairings of papers is going to be opened up today by a focus in on an artwork, partly to try to sort of encourage, thinking through images throughout the day as we then keep going into papers. So the first artwork that we'll be discussing is one that we're really fortunate to have in the room with us physically. In the back corner of the exhibition here at e-flux, there's a small drawing, quite wispy graphite on paper, of two insect-like people. And it was drawn in 1974 by the artist Bonita Ely, who we have with us on the stage. It's part of a larger cycle of work called At Home with the Locust People, which is quite, I think, an early and defining work for Bonita's practice. And I would certainly personally say that Bonita's work is one of the most significant and radical feminist practices that emerged in Australia through the 1970s. So it's really a special moment to have this work in New York at this moment. And Bonita, could you tell us first of all just about this actual sketch, where it sat within what became a year and a half's worth of work for you?
It was a preliminary drawing, trying out different poses for some paintings, and it was derived from ideas about if we were to compose a mythological beast for the 20th century, which creature would we combine the human form with to express where we were at as a culture and belief system? And I'd been looking at the mythological works in the British Museum and the Met, and I decided the locust was the one. Yes.
So the work occurred shortly after you'd been to London, and then you'd arrived to New York, and it should be noted that you grew up in regional Victoria, actually quite far up on the Murray.
That's correct.
And that this work, this focus on locust people, arrived as a response to high-density metropolitan living.
Yes. Yes, in London I made works. One was called The World is My Ashtray, because London was so polluted, not just in the streets, but also air pollution was really dense. And when I came to New York, I found the same thing. My partner was from a very wealthy family, and we were very graciously accommodated in the top of a building on Lower West Street, overlooking the Hudson Bay, the Statue of Liberty, Staten Island, etc., etc. So it was a classic place to be living in New York. And the sunsets were absolutely surreal, so I started taking slides of them. Every evening that I was home, I took a slide of the sunset. And when I got back to Sydney, I started making the installation called 20th Century Mythological Beasts at Home with the Locust People. And I wanted people to enter into the work, into the living room of the locust people, and become embedded into their environment. And at that time, this is 1975, artworks were precious. You didn't touch them, You didn't go anywhere near them. So to lure people in, I decided to make the sunset video. So I set up 80 of the slides of sunsets in New York and put them on Dissolve. And a friend, Sue Ford, some of you from Australia will know the work of Sue Ford. She was my a camera person, and she zoomed in on them, panned across them, and made it seem like we were actually there in the landscape videoing the slides, or the landscape, the sunsets, sorry. And that's where this that's how this work evolved.
Yeah, it's visceral and striking and feels only, you know, more and more appropriate as I look at it now. In terms of the papers that we have coming up immediately next, both of them in some ways deal with the relation of housing and home, and also the materiality of what can be a home when it's pulled apart and taken as material value as well. Something that I'd always thought about with this work was sort of understanding these people in terms of exoskeletons and the city as a kind of an exoskeleton, but something that I didn't know until we'd met recently and talked about it again was that it was specifically the, how do you say, like the elite housing in New York that had inspired this?
Well, it was the first time I'd ever become intimately involved in a wealthy family's lifestyle, and I was quite astonished. They had a house on Long Island that was completely interior decorated, and I mimicked the interior decoration of one of the daughters' bedrooms, which was covered completely in the same floral pattern. So the bedspread, the wallpaper, the furniture, everything had the same pink floral pattern on it, and that was the bedroom that I slept in when we went to that place. There was also a mansion with a huge formal garden and a swimming pool in a different place on Long Island, plus this building on West Street. And I guess having been brought up by parents who went through the Depression and the Second World War and were very frugal, everything was recycled. If something broke, you fixed it. It was kind of, it was a real insight to me on how profligate we are with the landscape, or rather the environment, with resources and so on and so forth, that we just indulge in so much waste. So it added to the awareness of how polluted the planet was getting at that time. Yeah.
So the audience can see the sunset video up there within the Symphony of Liberalism at the moment, which, as Bonita has said, was an early experiment in video work in the mid-70s, but then embedded within this kind of alienated domestic space. So with that, I think we might pass forward to the first two papers of the day. Thank you so much for contributing this work, Bonita.
Thank you.
It's beautiful to have it in this space. So the artist, activist, and researcher Alan Michelson will be moderating the first program, which will feature Cassie Fennell and Rachel O'Reilly. And Alan, I might hand it to you.
Great. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Well, everybody, I want to thank Vivian and e-flux and all the organizers of this, what is it, an ex-bis seminar, I think they called it last night, for inviting me to participate, both as an artist in the exhibition and as moderator in the discussion today. I'm a Turtle Clan Mohawk from 6 Nations of the Grand River and a resident of New York, along with about 100,000 other Native people. I'm also co-founder and organizer with the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School of an initiative, recent initiative that's actually going on still, called Indigenous New York. And we're planning our big artist event next month, November 17th and 18th. Get a little plug in. You know, there's a brilliant cohort of native scholars that have been circulating on Turtle Island recently, including Audra Simpson at Columbia here, Jolene Rickard at Cornell, Jody Bird at the University of Illinois, Glenn Coulthard at UBC, and others. Unfortunately for you, I'm not one of them. I'm an artist, and so I'll be speaking from an artist perspective about the work that I've done in terms of place and colonialism and memory, and the way all these things sort of are interspersed with the talks that we're going to hear very soon. So I'd like to introduce Rachel to come up here, Rachel O'Reilly, to give her presentation. Rachel.
Testing, yes. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation, so maybe I can be monitored in terms of time for that reason. I was wondering, I have a project called The Gas Imaginary, and it basically looks at the forms and norms of unconventional extraction, particularly fracking, in Australia, and its continuity and differencing from modernist mining regimes and imaginations, and particularly as the industry has rolled out internally to the indebted settler states of the West, and we are in the place that conceived of this project. So there's not so much I can say that's going to be new to you. So I thought about what I could bring, and what I wanted to talk about today was, I'm going to focus on three aspects of the kinds of analytics that come from this project. And the first is reframing dematerialization. The second is research into the specific history of Australian colonial land law that is quite unique in the development of some of the tools and strategies of global capital, which I call Topsoil Citizenship and the Settler's Historyless Head. And the third is thinking about forms, and this is more for the discussion, but thinking about forms of dislocated responsibility and responsibility through and beyond the aesthetic in the context of new waves of land grabs. So these are two quotes. The first is from Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, which he wrote to make British law sound especially rational during the phases of the American colonization of the Americas, and which has just informed the way that law was thought as it landed into Australia. The second quote is from a Royal Commission in Britain into the feudal property system, during which it was discussed that they wanted to liberate a new capitalist concept of land for Britain, but the aristocracy was a huge barrier for thinking about capitalisation at that time. And he says, to make land as easily transferable as stock would be one of the greatest economic improvements which could be bestowed upon the country. So the art history teaser in the blurb of my talk, pointing to the 60s and 70s Americanist conceptual practices, is really just a teaser, but Lippard wrote that early thesis on dematerialization, and it's a kind of accelerationist thesis. It's based on a minor American Cubist painter, Joseph Slinger's book called The Mathematical Basis of the Arts. And in that argument, in that small book, he teleologized a move in art away from so-called anti-intellectual emotional processes of art making to an ultra-conceptual art that would liberate the idea from matter. It's actually quite an anthropological teleology, and it begins with biomimicry and ritual religious stuff and ends in scientific experimentalism towards a perfect art that turns into zero art as a critique of the quantity. And it's very interesting to reread again because it reads less like a theory of abolition than of very basic processes of real abstraction in settler colonialism. So that's not the dematerialization that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is not some crude retraction of matter from late economized or suddenly financialized things, since there is always matter somewhere, or waste, but a process, quoting my friend Chris Cohen's writing on this 60s phase of conceptualism, of a different imbrication of materiality and law, as law comes to protect materialities that are decreasingly singular, decreasingly fixed in space, and decreasingly distinct from the work of subjectivity. So conceptualism at that time is really traumatized by the digital economy and the pending intellectual property project of that time, as well as being supposedly concerned with disappearing the art commodity. And we can think about dramas of value of that kind as involving putting in motion a struggle that's waged across cultural and juridical realism over what is going to re-secure that value, or how it will remain insecure, and how people are going to deal with the insecurity of certain kinds of material values or values of matter. The most interesting section in that essay comes when she laments that the 0 point of art that she's actually rooting for won't happen. And she says, and I quote, "Conceptual art has not as yet broken down the real barriers between the art context and those external disciplines, social, scientific, and academic, from which it draws sustenance. While it has become feasible for artists to deal with technical concepts in their own imaginations rather than having to struggle with constructive techniques beyond their capacities and their financial means, interactions between mathematics and art, philosophy and art, literature and art, politics and art are still at a very primitive level." So the art historical provocation is just to point that out and think about how denaturalizing settler colonial standing within the story of art's history and the way in which Americanist art mirrored the fractal project of European modernism puts us in extremely interesting ground. So the second note, and this is adding up to a longer kind of argument, and I'm just chunking bits forward. So the second note is about the dematerialization of the land object. And these are the drawings that I've been making, diagramming the analytics of the rollout of the fracking industry. They're very small, so I can't really project them, so we'll have to show them some other time. This is the famous river fire of the Cuyahoga River that inspired the EPA's first Clean Water Acts in the States that the fracking industry avoided when Halliburton campaigned to the American government to make it possible for the industry to happen. So the temporality here, what's interesting about this image is that it actually wasn't the worst river fire. River fires happened throughout the 20th century, and this is just one of them, and it wasn't the biggest, but it just happened to be the moment when the environmental movement was peaking, and sometimes photographers flew over that river and took images of that fire. And of course, that the temporality returns in the context of the current crackdown and destruction of the EPA, which is now headed by the guy who helped Cheney write fracking away from the Clean Water Act. I'll get back to that. So this is the kind of map of contemporary art that I'm talking about. This image, I've just taken this from the web, but it shows a distorted world map according to the relative amount of land grabs in each country. In other words, the area of each country was rescaled in proportion to the amount of land that's been acquired by foreign investors after 2006. So when the fracking industry came to Australia in 2009, just 2 years after the Northern Territory intervention pushed our Caribbean friends into homelessness in the Northern Territory, it installed itself via an ecocidal dredging project through the east coast harbour of my hometown called Gladstone, the unceded land of the Grang people, and through my former museum workplace in a lucrative 5-year sponsorship deal. The first 1,000 wells were installed in some of the most productive settler agricultural land in the southwest of the state. Before the first well was fracked, a major dredging project on the bottom left-hand side it was unprecedented in scale, and it was under-regulated, and it produced mass fish kills, turtle and dugong deaths, and major seagrass die-off in a heritage-protected area of the Great Barrier Reef. And dredging is this process of scooping up silt and mud and toxins from the bottom of the ocean with a kind of a bulldozer kind of thing. But it's also a metaphor for memory recovery and unwelcome retrospection. The police cars are sponsored by the gas company that's sponsoring my museum. You can see that there. So I want you to keep this image on the left-hand side, this vertical image that's a demo image of how the fracking industry works, which is literally like settler conceptual concept of land. It's an isometric package floating on a vacant background. The image on the right is the image that was used by one of the gas companies to publicly mediate the install of not one, but tens of thousands of wells across a very large area. So you can see that there's one spot there where a gas well is supposed to be heading through the coal seam, and the whole thing is like not to scale, obviously. And the quote is from the amazing woman who whistle blew the project about 2 years after I started the research. So all of the things that were basically gossip in my archive became verifiable as facts at that time. This image was given to me by one of the women who voluntarily drive around southwest Queensland documenting company incursions into land. It's the only image I've ever been able to find that actually puts the Great Artesian Basin on top of the images of wellheads and licenses. So that red section is actually the a major single underground water basin on the east coast in one of the driest continents on Earth. You can see the titling laid out for some of the petroleum and gas industry licensing and exploration in the Northern Territory there as well, and all of that orange section is all differently licensed Aboriginal land in majority differently licensed Aboriginal land that has been under military occupation for 10 years. I just want to accelerate a bit through here. So under these shifts of late liberalism, there is a kind of trauma observable among formerly protected European modelled citizen-ships needing to become grassroots materially literate in because suddenly overexposed to accumulation processes as if they're happening for the first time. It took more than 4 years for an Aboriginal protagonist to feature in one of Lock the Gate's East Coast campaign videos. And Lock the Gate, it was the major resistance movement to the fracking industry in that pastoral land on the East Coast. It took 4 years for that to happen, and the image was documenting a mining company's destruction of a sacred site near Kilcoy, as if that coupling is complementary to a regional critique of property invasions. This convenient and fleeting appearance of Indigenous ontologies on the supplementary side of pastoralist defences against corporate invasion spoke to a particularly situated contradictory struggle for settler justice on the East Coast. Well, of course, firing up existent and new grassroots Indigenous climate justice groups that resisted these logics, and one of those is SEED, who we've interviewed as part of the Frontier Imaginaries project. The Darling Downs has a well-documented history of concerted Aboriginal resistance to pastoral conquest, and this is the other extreme contradiction of the settler justice struggle in this area, and was the location of some of the most organised interclan Aboriginal guerrilla resistance projects during 80 years of frontier wars there, which are never mentioned in the East Coast settler resistance project. The Battle of One Tree Hill was an ambush-style blockade of low casualty and ongoing harassment that was not valued in military history until the last couple of decades, because the tactics weren't traditionally lethal in terms of judging certain kinds of warfare. So since 2009, in the state with some of the weakest native title rights, which are not land rights, that state now hosts tens of thousands of wells on the largest underground artesian basin system in one of the driest continents on Earth. Mining projects in Queensland have unlimited rights to draw that water for free in perpetuity, and it's increasingly sinking while bores and waterholes are drying out and being pumped with methane and fracking chemicals. Settler citizenship still refuses to tell the time of history beyond their own dispossession, and consistently narrates the story in terms of property trauma. And one of the most effective NGOs that's doing test cases against the fracking companies is called Property Rights Australia, and it's a Grazier's organisation. So how do we think about this? When I was trying to understand the continuity between the special economic zone and the history of the colonisation of Australia, and we could think about Australia as actually one of the early special economic zones in terms of the entire territory of the place, because of the way that financialisation was used to settle it, and that also happened in the States. The difference is that Australia was illegally colonised by the British Empire's own standards of conquest at the time of its invasion. It was the only colony in which operative treaties have not been signed until today. The legal establishment retroactively wrote the juridical fiction and doctrine of terra nullius, the concept of land belonging to nobody, into domestic rulings to cover over the rationality of the occupation. But that legal fiction only starts to appear in the legal record 50 years after the colonisation, but during which time the colonists vacillated between imagining Aboriginal people as protectable by certain laws or as internal foreign enemies. So this lawlessness of the whole project, which, I'm not that interested in law, but it makes us attend to how settler justice gets secured in settler imagination. So how people think that they have a particular right to certain kinds of inheritances that are absolutely divorced from the material history of the land. And this is my final note, really, and I really am taking too much time. But basically, the same decade as the bubble in US land and slave labour burst in the 1830s in the States, the English were being encouraged to move as the first free settlers to South Australia and claim land in a new colony of South Australia, based on wool, so sheep farming. They wanted to avoid the frontier violence that was happening in Queensland and reaching the consciousness of the polity. And at the time, the King wrote a missive called the Letters Patent, which was very interesting, that recognised Indigenous land holdings. And that was a condition of the free settlement of the colonisation of South Australia. What's interesting about that is the way that it it manoeuvred, or it made the manoeuvring of settler property law, it gave it a particular setup. So at this time, there was a guy called Robert Richard Torrens, who was an Irish-born shipping officer with no legal training whatsoever, who campaigned for Parliament to reform the British land laws to make it possible to liberate a more capitalist property system for the colonisation of Australia. Torrens argued, and this is my, was one of the, I wouldn't call it a smoking gun because there's so many instruments that go into this colonial project. But when I thought through the consequences of this particular legal history, it's extremely fascinating as a kind of technical explanation for settler imagination. So Torrens invented a system that could, as he quoted, play out the game of life in a more workaday part of the globe in terms of the property system. His epochal sleight of hand was to advocate for a title registering system that idealised an abstract equivalence between existing British legal models of shipped property and landed property, to abstract the concept of land entirely as a full-blown commodity, separated from, quote, prior relations of ownership, and to whatever degree possible from particular and individualised characters or traits. And by individualised characters or traits, he's talking about the need to inspect a piece of property, a piece of landed property before you purchased it, and secure with the people living there and around there who were performing their possession of territory in order to make sure that when you owned the land, you would own it outright. So the system that he invented, and this is the key technicity, has three principles: the mirror, the curtain, and indemnity. As in the manner of shipped property, the mirror meant that the government's register, it's the first time they have a central register of managing the land. The mirror meant that the government's register would not recognise any person written on the title unless that person could hold up the piece of paper to the state, to the Crown, and show that they were the identical person written into the register. So that's already tautological. The second principle is the curtain principle, and it suggests that beyond that already kind of 2D Hegelian recognition system, the curtain principle allows the person whose name is on the title to ignore other potential claims for ownership, even if they exist. So the curtain enables the owner to block certain realities from view without saying they don't exist, just allowing the title holder to legally pretend, that's the key words, that they don't, which formally concurred with the unofficial legal standing of the colonial project. And this is Torrens' way of dealing with this letters of patent situation where Indigenous land possession is recognised, and he has to come up with a less violent way of handing out all of these settlers' property. Most of the investors of which will never visit Australia. So the insurance principle is the final one, and this was the first time in the British imperial system that the Crown guaranteed losses due to property fraud. In 1925, when the system was finally installed in England, and around the same time, this negotiation was happening between Britain and Australia, because the capitalists in Britain also wanted liberated property laws. They didn't want aristocrats sitting on large estates. They wanted to make bigger factories, especially after the abolition of slavery. So in 1925, when it comes back to Britain finally, the legal theorists there, particularly a guy called Alan Pottage, understand this project as inventing a fundamentally new grammar of property. Torrens does two things. It thins and sheds the material integrity of the land, stripping it of all range of particularities. But secondly, it disconnects land from land, turning land into a thing that is modelled especially opposite to land. As Brenna Bandar notes, and she has wonderful research on this history, the removal of the socio-legal requirement of retrospection that was once key to security of transfer at the point of sale. So retrospection as in you have to look back to see who else might have a stake in the thing that you're buying, but also retrospection in terms of who within like genealogical histories of property is carrying up the deed through a good chain of title. So a good family sitting on land for a long time guarantees you a certain good chain of title in the feudal system, right? So as she notes, it's practically a land manufacturing system built entirely on paper and administrative infrastructure. And the pathological language used to describe its efficiency betrays the psychic states of colonial contradiction management and double bookkeeping consciousness that it aimed to maintain at that time. In 1958, a scholar called Ruoff wrote, anterior defects of title are cured, and thenceforth all investigations of the history of how the named owner came to be entitled is ruled out forever, and all future transactions are carried out by simple forms and simple machinery. Enamoured commentators went so far as to describe the Torrens system as a hospital for landed property and subjectivity. It makes things, this is a quote, it makes things better, cures invalidities, and means the end of the need to look backwards for possible flaws. Torrens himself got on a boat and promoted his registry system directly to Western Canada, after which it quickly spread across the empire to Hawaii, the Philippines, some Latin American jurisdictions, Ireland, Israel, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, Thailand, and a number of US states. It's now the preferred land registry system of the IMF since the mid-2000s and is presently being used to dispossess peasants from customary title usages throughout Southeast Asia. Many of these places are described as having bijural property imaginaries, and this is not so much an ethical nomenclature as a giving of cultural literacy to investors, right? So since the Torrens system was so powerful that it doesn't actually explain the historic remains of what else is socially playing out as local rules of property dealing and relating, what stands out is a geontological dematerialization, and lest we treat this as some kind of capitalist realist history of a flattened now, what it does is it speaks to current struggles around the politics of eco-social reproduction or world ecology, whatever you want to call that in any language. And it uses basically confuses use and value in ways that are calling forth new and unconventional resistances to unconventional extractive processes and land grabbing processes. Where to end with this? So this is basically in continuity with a bunch of scholarship on whiteness and possession and whiteness and the naturalization of property. And I'm not really saying anything new about it, but the question is, to me, this is one kind of aspect of the kind of formal work that we do as artists or as thinkers or as conversationalists to denaturalize kind of settler attachments to certain kinds of contracts of democracy and of justice and these kinds of things. Now, the Darling Downs farmers in Queensland, where I was talking about the first install in the agricultural land in Australia, understand they've been a sacrifice zone for the industry and a space of experimentation. The struggle is pretty much over, and reproduction is key. There's, water delivery is the main project, while many of the women in the communities volunteer their time to blockades and help to mediate the drama and the resistance to the installation tactics elsewhere. The precedent set by this first install has been that gas that the gas licenses were given out with very limited regulations in terms of water usage in particular, and most of the gas is going overseas because the state didn't request that it keep gas for the local market, creating false scarcity in the Australian market. And under this fiction, this is where we should end up, under this fiction of the gas shortage, the federal government is pressuring all Australian states to frack their gas, including where our friends live in the Northern Territory, where they've been living under that military occupation for 10 years. The settlers are now understanding that that project as a next level land grab, finally, and at the same time, we have a mining magnate writing punitive welfare policy for the federal government in the same areas that his own mining projects are hoping to play out. One among many government-funded consulting companies is driving around the Northern Territory, and they're called Intercultural Consulting, and they're supposedly have been doing a social impact statement for the fracking industry. At the same time, recordings of these meetings have shown up the company as advising Aboriginal communities to use their land as a bargaining chip in a process that they're being told is inevitable, despite the fact that the economic case for the fracking there is negative to zero. Liberal settler NGOs refuse to engage the ideological aspect of this project and merely turn up to do consulting work explaining the negative economic case of the project. So space is being again filled with law at a distance, which are the habits of property that in the natural law thinkers materialize in the settler colony. And these are the limits to the, sorry, these are the limits to the settler justice project that ask us to do many other things with forms and norms of comportment, basically. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Cassie Fennell, come up and read her.
I just want to thank everyone for inviting me and for including me in this program and for spending your Saturdays here. It's a beautiful day, so I know that it's a lot to give up. I am going to be speaking a little bit about a research project that I am getting back into after some time away from it, and it focuses on the afterlife of houses in the industrial urban Midwest. And I'll be reading a paper, but I also have some images to show you, and they come at the beginning quite a lot. So if you want to look at one longer than I flash it on, just tell me, and I'll stop on it. Okay. So when it opened in 1929, Detroit's Guardian Building was known as the Cathedral of Finance, as it housed just under half the city's financial services firms. Its restored lobby remains true to that moniker. Blue light, filtered through stained glass, still bounces through the three-story vaulted lobby, illuminating the teller stations of an active bank. A grand fresco covers the entire easterly wall, and at its center stands a glowing indigenous woman, which you see here. She lights up the seams of timber, minerals, and fish that once propelled this region's economic might and the rise of its great industrial cities. So if you can see, she has these rays coming out of her body, and they move to different natural and manufactured seams of wealth in the region. Nowadays, we know these cities better for their staggering economic decline, their depopulation, and their intense environmental degradation. So it's hard to imagine their current abundances, debt, toxins, abandoned structures, large tracts of land riddled with wasted and rotting things, so venerated as you see here. And here's just an image of some of the things that you find that just turn up, right, this is in Detroit. These are doors from houses, but those are also beehives constructed from drawers from houses. And there are quite a lot of abandoned fruit trees that used to belong to houses, but now just drop their fruit. Yet in my ongoing research on the social and material afterlives of mortgage homeownership in the late industrial Midwest, such strange abundances are the very things through which some people are now routing projects of futurity and flourishing. And today I want to talk about just one of those projects. Okay. For proponents of the urban Midwest's burgeoning deconstruction movement, the vast pine, maple, and oak forests that once ringed the Great Lakes did not disappear with the 19th century timber booms and busts. I think people might know about these booms and busts, but by the late 18th century, about somewhere around like 32 billion board feet had been pulled out of just that one corner of Michigan on the right, the peninsula jutting out. So it was enormous cutting of lumber, right? And this is one of these booms. These old-growth forests, they say, stand still as the forest behind the walls and the bones of ancient forests ready to be harvested from the region's derelict houses. Okay. There's gold in those hills, a 30-something architect proclaimed before an audience at the EPA's Region 5 headquarters in June 2015. And this is the EPA headquarters that is now embattled with problems like Flint. Architects, builders, public health advocates, and environmental regulators had all gathered in Chicago to discuss the market in reclaimed lumber from vacant houses. We just need to figure out how much gold, where those hills are, and how to get it out. Detroit, she continued in a conversation with me several weeks later, is basically a standing forest that's been abandoned with all its roofs coming off. So please harvest that forest before it rots. But to do that, we need it all mapped. I want the USGS, so that's the United States Geological Survey, to map it as if we're a copper mine. And then, I hate to say it, all us fools can rush in. Vacant and abandoned houses weigh upon those who live with them, as well as officials tasked with managing the physical dangers they pose to neighbors, alongside the fiscal ones they pose to municipal coffers starved of revenue that once was generated by property taxes. Yet their sheer number has also enlivened an unexpected ecological ethos, and it's that ethos that I want to talk about today. I'll have time to explore just two things. So first, by way of introducing deconstruction in this region, I'll situate the mortgaged American house as a structure that flickers constantly between its status as intergenerational wealth and waste transfer. Gesundheit. Second, I'll draw on my ongoing conversations with the region's deconstruction proponents and enthusiasts to begin unpacking the sensibilities that are now gathering around two practices of house disposal, and one is letting them rot, and the other is sparing them from the landfill. Okay. So among those who are involved in building demolition, deconstruction is not a school of literary analysis, just so you know, but a process by which a building is taken apart piece by piece so that its parts can be salvaged for future building and fabrication projects. As formalized in the past several decades, deconstruction is an ecological response to the oft-reported factoid that in the US at least, construction and demolition debris is said to make up half of materials in our landfills. Proponents in Midwestern cities underscore that while this region has suffered substantial losses over the past 40 years, so of jobs, of people, of industry, it does have plenty of one thing, and that is hundreds upon thousands of vacant houses that now cover cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Joliet, St. Louis, Gary, the list goes on. They hold up this deconstruction as an economic development strategy that could bring what they call skilled green jobs to hard-to-employ persons, and they're talking about ex-felons here, mostly. And compared to traditional demolition with a wrecking ball, they underscore that deconstruction involves fewer disturbances of harmful building materials, especially of asbestos and lead. Deconstruction purists insist on recovering as much of a building as possible, including fixtures, floorboards, roofing tiles, and nails. But those who are interested in generating large-scale markets tend to focus their attention on houses as sources of sustainable lumber. Okay, so here's some of the lumber pulled out of Detroit houses. And here are some nails that that I spent pounding out of boards this summer, which were then saved for other things. Okay. They point to growing demand from architects, interior designers, and furniture makers for a reliable supply of old-growth woods, which they say can be put to use in building and fabrication projects. Pilot projects started taking off in cities across the region in the years immediately following the 2008 mortgage crisis, funded usually through a mix of federal and state workforce development grants. Detroit looms especially large in the imagination of the region's deconstruction proponents because the number of houses there with potentially available materials stands out, even in a region that is dotted with what are called shrinking cities. A half-century of industrial flight and out-migration precipitated by rampant speculation and tax and mortgage foreclosure have left the city, quote, overbuilt for the population it now supports, with so many solidly built single-family houses that are now empty. In the spring of 2014, the mayoral administration unrolled a program to remove 40,000 vacant houses, and most of the 13,000 demolished so far have landed in what one young urban planner who works in Detroit calls, quote, the hills of southeastern Michigan, and that is the region's ubiquitous landfills. So equations of abandoned houses with mineral seams may seem strange and unexpected, but they're not exactly surprising. Federal policies established already in the 1930s positioned mortgage homeownership among middle class or middle class aspiring Americans as key to expanding wealth and well-being. Taking on a mortgage, if you could do that, would allow some, but not all American households to distribute their housing costs over time, all the while they leverage the appreciating value of this major asset to finance things that the members of their households might want or just need, right? So business ventures, educations, retirement, second homes, in watery places like the upper Midwest, maybe a modest little boat. The mortgage home promised to propel a household towards the good and getting better life, usually with enough wealth left over to pass on and to launch the subsequent generation of children. It's important to know that these promises of well-being exceed individual households because in the US, many municipalities draw on revenues generated from property taxes to fund critical services and amenities for all of their citizens, right? So if you want a good sanitation and education system, you have to have a sound property tax system, right, in many places. So as much as these houses have been positioned as vehicles for generating, expanding, and transferring wealth and well-being between parents and children, between citizens, their cities, and their polities, they are also capable of destroying both. This capacity is very evident throughout the US in the wake of the 2008 mortgage crisis, but it's especially evident in areas that were long plagued with a glut of vacant houses well before that crisis started, right? So especially the late industrial Midwest. As owners stop paying down mortgages and property taxes, these structures can and do spiral into disrepair. Detroit boasts an especially virulent strain, prone as its abandoned houses are to toppling over in strong winds, to catching and spreading fire, to attracting dumping, to growing wild with weeds and animals, and some claim to leaching toxins in the air and the soils. Such structures further devalue surrounding properties, making it that much more likely, city officials have worried, that remaining neighbors will also stop paying their property taxes and eventually walk away, leading to what they call the spread of blight. Its demolition program emerged to dispose of vacant properties in ways that might stabilize and then eventually bolster surrounding property values. So these houses that are no longer homes flicker ambiguously and constantly between their potential to generate and spread wealth and waste across space and time. Such ambiguity speaks to thinkers who have approached energy as a problem of unrealized abundance instead of presumed scarcity. Consider, for instance, George Bataille's efforts to develop a theory of the general economy grounded in expenditure instead of production, and with that theory to bypass concerns about the calibration of supply and demand. This is a theory based on a simple idea. He tells us that organisms receive far more energy than needed to maintain their basic functions, and that unusable energy becomes an excess or a wealth, a capacious category that for him can include everything from an abundance of life forces or material goods and resources to an abundance of people. When that wealth cannot be reabsorbed, that is, when it can no longer be used to grow that particular system, be that system a living organism or a complex social order, it, quote, must be spent willingly or not, gloriously or catastrophically, unquote. He can seem quite agnostic about the form that expenditure takes when he moves through cases that include everything from the destruction of goods during Native American potlatch ceremonies to the annihilation of surplus populations during war. But that agnosticism is tempered by the fact that for him, expenditure is a profoundly ethical matter. It opens up a choice concerning which expenditures will suit a group at a given point in time. So alongside the possibility of choices that lead to violent squander, emerge those that would subordinate the pursuit of growth to that of giving. And it's this subordination, others suggest, that can incite a generosity that pulls a group beyond its narrow concerns in space and time. So it's precisely the potentials of such generosity that deconstruction proponents and enthusiasts have emphasized, right, even though they don't read Bataille, right, they emphasize this kind of generosity, right, surprise, in the late industrial urban Midwest. And below, I just want to sketch about how some of them articulate this generosity by paying attention to the temporal spans and obligations that they're suggesting are opened up when you go in and you can deconstruct a house and you salvage its materials for yourself or for future unknown people. Okay, so demolition contractors in this region, and especially in Detroit, have emphasized again and again and again to me that the fact that a large-scale deconstruction effort hasn't exactly gotten off the ground in a place where ideal conditions exist mean that it's essentially economically unviable, right? They tell me labor costs are simply too high and logistics are too complicated. What takes a two-person crew and an excavator and a morning to demolish, right, will take a 6-person crew 5 days to deconstruct by hand, right? And if you are doing mass demolition of the built environment, you don't want to lose any time, right? So this is thought to be an inefficient way to do this, right? In response, some deconstruction proponents argue that deconstruction could be competitive, economically competitive, if you accounted for the labor costs recovered on the back end, that is, after you sell all this valuable material. Yet others, and these are the people that interest me the most, insist that the practice has value that far exceeded concerns about cost effectiveness and practicality. And they grounded that value on assertions that the practice could foster active commitments to the past and to the future. So I just want to talk about 2 young women here who subscribe to this view in some ways, right? So consider first a woman I'll call Henley. She's a white woman about 30 who comes from Michigan, who made ample use of reclaimed lumber when building out the interiors of a business several years ago. Customers encounter it in everything from benches fabricated from reclaimed barnwood in abandoned rural corners of the state, to counters that are inlaid with lath. And I don't know if people know what lath is. So pre-drywall lath are these thin strips of wood that you would slap plaster on, right? But because that plaster for a long time included lead and asbestos, the lath may also include those things. So when I asked her in late 2015 why she gravitated towards this material, she waxed philosophical. She said, "We feel, quote, an ancestral connection to wood," she noted, because trees bear witness to multiple human generations, even as they remain, quote, attached to the earth in an animate way. She thought that being around reclaimed wood gave people a sense that they had inherited some of this lost lineage, right, of those forests that were felled, right? But also that they were contributing something to that lineage as they move forward. What's more, she saw it as an endlessly renewable resource. It will never run out, she insisted, because we will always be building and tearing down. Think about the flies and the maggots that swarm on a dead body. Maybe they're unappealing, but they are moving the process of regeneration along. So with her turn to flies and maggots, Henley was moving past the temporal spans of individuals and generations, and also intergenerations, to embrace an aesthetics of the unappealing that might foster an appreciation for much more expansive cycles of growth, decline, and regeneration, right? So she's entering something closer to geologic time. Such concerns about futurity in the past are even more prevalent in my ongoing conversations with my favorite reclaimed lumber broker, right, if you're listening, a white woman in her late 30s who also hails from central Michigan. McQueen, as she calls herself, sources wood from the region but bases her retail operations out of Chicago, where the reclaimed market is much more developed. And there's reasons for this that have to do with previous cycles of extraction and development in the region. For McQueen, learning to appreciate and work with reclaimed lumber is not just about fostering temporal orientations that stretch past human generations, although for her, she's very interested in that, and she markets her product as heritage lumber, right? But she also thinks this can do something for the state of labor, especially as young people face it in the region. So consider her thoughts on working with reclaimed materials. This is a quote from her. "There's endless supply, but it's the getting that's hard. It's easier if you have a lot of tools, a truck, you're strong, and you have people to help you. and if you're willing to get dirty and breathe some crap into your lungs. Then you have to have patience and time to work with the wood properly. Put a metal detector over it because you have to have respect for your saw, right? The wood is full of nails, right? So you can't just run it through your saws if you want your saws to last, right? Not everybody is used to thinking of these steps because we have IKEA. You think you built that dresser because you put an Allen wrench to it? If you work for something, you're gonna love the shit out of it. If people make the table out of reclaimed lumber, every time they sit down to it, they will feel it was worth all those splinters, unquote. So McQueen recognizes that as an act of either absolute luxury or absolute desperation, right, both are at play here, to spend time, money, and mangled fingers dangling or diving into houses, but also dangling from houses that have become piles of wood and processing their yields, right? This is incredibly hard and dangerous work, right? Yet for her, that dive promises to revive work as an activity that transformed the body and the world. And in the end, she insists you are doing, quote, your population a service by diverting more materials from the landfills. Henley's efforts to attend to our situatedness in geologic time and McQueen's rejection of anodyne labor underscore something similar, an ethos that transcends immediate, narrow, or particular concerns with profit, gain, and practicality. For them, mining a wasted built environment and living with its tailings rejects conventional understandings of extraction as exploitation and depletion. And it reframes extraction as an affirmation of obligations between past and future generations and as an affirmation of the vitality of slow and inefficient human expenditures. So it may seem that once narrow concerns about gain and practicality or profit are put aside, the choice between letting a building rot, burn, or tumble over such that it becomes fit only for the landfill is easy, right? Why would you not, if profit wasn't an issue, why would you not treat it as a standing forest that can be taken from while seeding it for future generations? Yet McQueen's words about a luxurious or desperate practice of expenditure that will eventually benefit your population point to some problems for an ethos predicated upon managing the uncertainty with which abandoned houses are flickering between waste and wealth constantly. Population thinking, as Foucault taught us in his discussion of biopolitics, allows for interventions on the behalf of the well-being of an aggregate whole, so a population, even as it often entails sacrificing particular parts of that whole, right? So your population might on a whole benefit, but particular parts of it need to be sacrificed, right? McQueen knows that saving materials from the growing hills of southeastern Michigan requires individuals who sacrifice their time and energy as well as their health. You have to be willing to get splinters and breathe some crap into your lungs. But in the context she works in, that crap includes plaster and paint dust associated with everything from lung-based cancers to neurotoxins that severely impair the cognitive development of children. For many, breathing in such crap is not exactly a choice. It is a fact of living and working within the uncertain aftermaths of built environments that were once raised to protect us, but now more recently have come to endanger us. And it's here where my research keeps on tripping on the darker dimensions of living with late industrial life's strange abundances, abundances that can spend bodies both willingly and unwillingly, both gloriously and catastrophically. That's it.
Thank you, Cassie. What seems to link your two papers might be the destruction or collapse of place, but in different but interrelated scales and contexts. The finitude of the built environment mirrors and relates to finitude of human life, but the earth on which all building occurs has up until recently been thought to be more permanent and reliable. In our first treaty with the Europeans who entered our land in 1613, the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, we Haudenosaunee pledged that the agreement would be binding as long as the sun shines, the water flows, and the grass grows green, which now seems far from guaranteed. Can you comment on the destruction of place that seems a common thread in both of your presentations and on the psychic toll and social costs as well as the environmental and sort of financial ones? Yeah, who wants to?
I can start. So I would feel more, I guess I should speculate because this is research that's ongoing. I would feel much more confident addressing that in an earlier project, but maybe I should just focus on this because that's what I've talked about. I've been struck by the number of young people who consider themselves to be a diaspora, right? Part of a diaspora from the late industrial Midwest, right? That so many people come from Michigan and Ohio and Indiana, but they have left, right? They have left their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents behind. And they, you know, they left because there aren't any jobs for them. There are no ways to sort of be employed in ways that, you know, are viable and healthy, and in ways that can build their you know, wealth and place. And so there's such a weird lament that you hear people talking about, like, where are the young people? Where are the jobs? But where are the young people? And why do I only have to talk to old people for the rest of my days? You know, so there's this kind of sense that an entire economy that was built on generations being able to be working and reliably working in place through relatively unskilled jobs, right, has been completely torn apart. Of course, that's not the first time that's happened in this region, right? And I think you see that, I mean, obviously this looks pretty amazing. This is the same guy that did the murals in the Library of Congress, right? But this is a glorification of an earlier moment in which an entire way of living was eradicated by a different stage of capital, right? So, you know, I think what's remarkable about it is that these are folks who never thought it would happen to them, right? And so that feeds a kind of resentment that people are crediting with our current political situation with, right? That this region is what's given us Trumpism, because this region was promised a great America that has been torn apart, you know, abandoned, and their young folk have been scattered.
Absolutely. As a young chief, Ian Campbell said in a I Don't Know More rally in Vancouver in 2012, they're treating everyone like Indians these days. Yeah. But do you want to address this destruction of place as well?
Yeah, I mean, the harbour that I grew up on was totally industrialised since the 70s, and it has like 5 industries that precede the fracking coming in. So what I found interesting about the drama, the settler drama of imagination, was that like it was and I was studying it also because it was like absolutely classic kind of composure for this boom-bust development. And so, you know, even when the jobs aren't there and the houses are empty and people's property development goes massively down in a really accelerated way, the only kind of narrative is like, yeah, we're just ready for the next industry to come back, right? And what was interesting about the fracking was that, you know, it literally invades property imaginaries in a way that's never happened before. And so, but with the install in the harbour complex, which was already massively, you know, overdeveloped, but it was only when millions of fish started dying that they couldn't, in themselves, kind of hide the contradiction management that comes with like occupying an extractivist position. And so, you know, you look at all these unconventional extractive industry resistance projects, and they always say, you know, the settlers always say, like, the old mining was, you know, that was something, but then the new mining, we had to draw a line in the sand around the new mining. And so there's always kind of, you know, this kind of refusal to think the materiality all the way down, not just socially, but, you know, deontologically or whatever. Answering the question, destruction of place, the place was, you know, I mean, I had a nice childhood there and I loved my people or whatever, but the place was never, you know, it was never a pristine place. And so, you know, I think the beginning point in a kind of unrealized toxicity is really part of the kind of way in which, you know, the breakdown of, or the rematerialization needs to happen in terms of like narrative practices and that kind of thing. Because I think that this clinging to places is often more about clinging to opportunities and jobs and particular kinds of memories in which those things held up people to feel like they didn't have to struggle in certain kinds of contexts. And yeah, I mean, it is this kind of dislocated kind of contradiction management that gets dramatized by the reduction of the fantasy of place sometimes.
know, the toxic antics of our current president has attracted the concern of mental health professionals who recently published a bestseller entitled The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president, in which they posit a moral and civic duty to warn America and offer diagnoses. What strikes me about Trump is the way he reveals the sort of heartless cruelty and idiocy which characterizes extreme capitalism and its hostile policies targeting almost everything and everybody these days. These policies seem to point to a more widespread distribution of pathologies than the one that's obvious in Trump. Ones that are usually camouflaged behind the facades of American exceptionalism, rationality, and benevolence, but lurks in the very fabric of capitalist post-democracy as well as its earliest incarnations, all of which were built on a layer of colonialism and rest on a foundation of genocide and stolen indigenous land and sovereignty. Can you comment on this mentality as it relates to these issues that you've raised?
Well, I don't want to comment on the president's psychological state.
No, I'm talking about a sort of collective,
Yeah. I guess what is interesting is that people, the scale of environmental degradation and its health effects, right? And its capacity to reach a range of people, right? I think that in the past, the expectation was that some of these problems are relatively contained. It doesn't really affect me. I know that someone somewhere down and out might have a problem with this, right? But I think that we're dealing with with people looking at the after effects of failing to regulate these materials, right? These industries and their afterlives, and people are alive to the fact that that many people stand to be affected, right? And so I am actually a little bit bothered by some of the mobilizing around Flint, right? The kind of we are all Flint claims, because obviously we're not, right? It's like not any city that has a system of water that's poisoning its folks, but a predominantly black city, a down and out city, right? And so this cry has been mobilized, like we are all Flint, to call attention to the fact that many water infrastructures in the U.S., municipal water infrastructures, are potentially dangerous, right? But not all of them. Many of them are maintained in ways that hold that off. So, I mean, I do think there's a lot of possibility now that people are turning attention to the EPA and asking questions about what will these deregulations do? What will the fact that you have a chemical industries are now writing the regulations do for folks? But I do think there needs to be, and maybe it always has been like that, but it's much more obvious, right? It's much more blatant, right? It's not much more shameless to consult industries and have them write the regulations, right? But I do think that there needs to be, in this kind of growing awareness of these mutual risks, to understand that they're very still unevenly distributed, and there has to be a kind of politics that accounts for that. So I think that he is bringing to the fore and making much more transparent some of these developments that have been in place for a long time, right? And I think that many people who have lived downwind industry can tell you that, like for decades people have been sick, right? It's not new. But I do think it's worth thinking about how to canalize those politics to be aware of those different distributions.
Do you want to speak to that at all?
In terms of the Trump mentality, I mean, I think, that kind of consciousness is like massively more evenly distributed in settler colonial administration systems than we like to think. My research only started being an artistic research project when I was attending water management meetings around the destruction of the harbour. And it was the way that the consultants who were there to mediate between the state and the destruction and the so-called community in a kind of greenwashing process that happened twice, the way that they were using language just absolutely amazed me. Like the prior destruction of their vocabulary for even being able to talk about what their job was in relationship to what the material was that they were managing was so reduced. And Trump is just a kind of more exaggerated version of that. The destruction of language that precedes the settler colonial management of these systems is so extreme, and from having to kind of argue with these people, I started writing poetry like literally that night, because I couldn't believe the limits of their capacity for even verbalizing the fake version of what they were doing. Right? They weren't actually trying to help in any way, but even they had no decent vocabulary for faking an administrative process. Yeah.
So I Don't Know More and Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock are all examples of coalitions, recent coalitions, that have mobilized tools like social media and are trying to change things through peaceful protest. They've so far had a lot of success with drawing numbers and solidarity, but less so stopping the actual toxic legislation or environmental depredations that they're trying to prevent. I came up in the era of Vietnam protests where we eventually did shut down a war. Is there any hope for these sorts of coalitions and these sorts of, peaceful protest means, do you think?
Yeah, we have to hope that there is hope. We have to hope that there is hope. I think it has to get nerdy, though. I think that these movements have to get, they're very savvy digitally, and I think they just have to get nerdy with the nitty-gritty of regulations, how land is redistributed, like kind of speculation, what's kind of speculative institutions are involved in this, to really put pressure at particular nodes of this, right? I mean, it's one thing to call attention, and it's another thing to say this is a kind of moving beast with many different kinds of tentacles, like where do you put pressure? To put pressure in places that will matter, I think you do need to care about the law, you do need to get policy wonkish, you do need to get nerdy, or find nerds that are good at that, right? And while you do the the online platforms and stuff like that, right?
Do you want to just finish up with this question?
Yeah, I mean, in the context of art as well, I think this question gets really interesting, because I think what we're seeing, through the last decade or so is like artists working, as kind of like aesthetically literate private eyes with people who are doing legal projects. Forensic architecture is one of those projects, but there's a bunch of them. And for me, what concerns me in terms of being in the sites where people don't have the infrastructure to do any of those kind of private eye investigations, our valorization of those kinds of projects cannot happen without, at the same time, thinking through the way in which we perpetuate this kind of reduction of collective action, or the directness of collective action projects. Having said that, I am one of these nerds that Skypes with people in the. I'm hoping to Skype with people in the middle of Australia next week, and I'm trying to make use of my nerdiness in whatever way people want to use me. But I'm not going to make an art project that's about that aspect of the collaboration, right? Because that's something else, and I think that commoditizing the relationships are extremely problematic. Yeah.
Well, thank you both, and thank you all.
Thank you. That was an excellent session. So that session was called Frontier Properties. The next session will be called Volatile Properties. We started a bit late, so we're going to have a slightly shorter break, 15 minutes, and we'll start at, I believe it's 2:45 for the next session. Thanks.